What's going on, everyone? Today I'm here with Mr. Bill Fletcher Jr. He's a racial justice activist. He also wrote several books and had been a syndicated TV host. So, Mr. Bill Fletcher, thank you for joining us on the show.
I'm very pleased to be on the show. Thanks.
So, Bill, could you tell us, how did you get into racial justice?
You know, it actually all started when I was 13. I was interested in the world very early in elementary school. But when I was 13, in the fall of 1967, I read the autobiography of Malcolm X. And my parents had the book. It was in paperback. And I saw it, was curious about it, started reading it, and couldn't stop reading it. And so when I finished reading the book, I concluded that I knew what I wanted to do with my life. And that's no exaggeration. And I've been active ever since. I became active in high school, in radical Black student politics. I went to college, where I remained active as in the student movement. I got out of college, graduated from college, got involved in the labor movement, but with a particular focus on Black workers. And I've been doing that ever since. And, there was something that the autobiography of Malcolm X touched in me and led me to feel that I had to do something significant with my life, that it wasn't just about living. And that's the story.
Yeah, I agree with you 100% because, when I read through the book itself, and also looked into a lot of our brothers and sisters in the past and what they went through, I said, we got to continue this message, even here. And, I had a major shift just for me in 2015 that I had to just do more than what I was originally doing. So I definitely understand that particular portion of it. Now, you say you got involved with Black workers.
Yes.
As well. And let me ask you a question. You wrote a book about unions. Why is it that we don't have more Black unions?
That's a complicated question. I guess I would start with the problem. There's an issue of Black unions, and then there's the issue of Black trade unionists. All right, so unions, as my book, They're Bankrupting Us, and 20 Other Myths About Unions, tries to get at, giving some historical background. Unions are organizations of workers, and they come together frequently in workplaces or in industries. And in the recent era, by which I mean over the last 75 years, you're talking about workplaces that have all kinds of workers, African American, Latino, white, etc. The union is supposed to represent all of them. So the idea of having a Black-only union runs counter to that. Once upon a time, up until 1964, there were in fact unions in this country that were all white and that were exclusive. But that became illegal with the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And so you've had more of a desegregation ever since. So that's one part of the answer. The other part, which may or may not be what you're asking, is that's important to note, is that African Americans, as a percentage of our population, are more unionized than any other demographic in the United States. By which I'm saying about somewhere between, I believe, 15 and 18% of Black workers are unionized. And that's higher than any other group. So one of the things that you find is that we tend to be, as a population, very pro-union. We tend to be very active. If you go into workplaces where there are unions, it is very likely, if you're in a mixed workforce, that the Black members are more active as a percentage than whites. If a union is trying to organize, it's very, very common that the first workers that are interested are African American, and among them, African American women. So this is something that goes back, actually, you could argue, to right after the Civil War, when the former slaves, the freed Africans, began organizing in the South and carrying on strikes and build organizations to improve their living standard. And so the legacy of black involvement in unions actually goes back to them.
So when I was saying about us having a black union, in other words, what I mean by, the leadership, everything is controlled, by black people, because most of these unions that we see isn't controlled, or even most of the leadership isn't black people, at least from what I've experienced in the petrochemical industry.
That's right. It depends to a great extent on the sector, but you're absolutely right. But I mean, it's changed considerably over the years, where you have a more diverse union leadership than in the past. But the factor of race and racism is, it's like welcome to the United States. It permeates every institution in this country. There is no institution that's impervious to that. And so race and racism absolutely appear in the unions. And you'll have some unions where the leadership is very hostile to anyone that's not white, coming in and becoming active. And that's one of the reasons, going back to when I graduated from college and got involved, I was interested in working and organizing with black workers to start to change the union movement, to make the union movement more representative than it was at the time, to increase the profile and leadership of black workers. And I've been doing that ever since. There are organizations that set out to do that as well. One of the most famous is the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, that was formed in 1973 and brought together black trade union activists from a whole set of unions. Their founding president, William Lucey, Bill Lucey, as people know him, played a major role in challenging organized labor and arguing for a greater role for black leadership, black staff, and they continue to this day.
So when you was talking about the union, and just from what I've seen, that, and I've noticed this, and I've talked to other black workers, is that like when you have some of these unions and you notice, like, let's say a white person have an issue on the job, they responded in one way, but if you're a black person or maybe a Hispanic or somebody else, they don't fight as hard. And I actually got to experience that firsthand myself. When I actually needed them, I paid my dues for close to 4 years. Never had no issues at all, but when I needed them, because it was an issue that happened, they didn't really fight, and that really. Go ahead.
I understand, and I would say that you're going to see that in some unions, and in other unions, you're going to see a very different type of response. And so you have to look at each circumstance to try to figure out what's really going on there. So in other words, it's useless to make any kind of sweeping proclamation or conclusion about it. You have to look at who's leading the union, what's the history, and things along those lines. And the other thing is, as with anything else, if there is no pressure, or to borrow from Frederick Douglass, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. So you can have an organization that is theoretically supposed to represent you, but if there is no pressure on it, it may not. We see that in other institutions in this country that are theoretically supposed to represent us. Unless we organize and put the pressure on the institution, they will frequently not do the job. And so I say to black workers where they have a union is that, first of all, it's better to be organized in a union than to not be organized, because you're just across the board, your living standard is going to be higher. Second, one of the things that a union will do through a collective bargaining agreement is to start with some provisions that that you can utilize to challenge injustices that take place in the workplace. If there is no union, you're subject to what's called being an employee at will, and which basically means that an employer can get rid of you for any reason or no reason, as long as it doesn't actually violate the law. But if an employer comes in, looks at you, and says, you know what, I don't need you anymore. That's it. That's what employer will is. So the union, the existence of the union and a collective bargaining agreement gives you certain basic rights. But that never means that you can sit back and be content and simply assume that everything is going to be hunky-dory, because it's not. If you don't keep the pressure on, things will tend to be weakened.
Yeah, because when I was in the union, yes, I only thing I did like about it was the money aspect. You was guaranteed your raises, your
Right.
bonuses, everything else, and they could not move from that. The people outside of a union that work for the company, 1 year they didn't get a raise, but everybody in the union got a raise that was underneath the CBA. But the question I have is, what about states that are right to work states like Texas?
Uh,
How how
so,
how does that work with unions?
okay, so right to work is a term as is a propagandistic term. The right to work does not mean that anyone has a right to work. What it means is that in a right to work state, it means that if you happen to be in a workplace where there is a union that represents the workforce, that you do not have to join the union and you don't have to pay any kind of fee to help to cover the cost of representation. Now, let me explain why this is absurd. Think for a second, if there's any city or town or state in the United States where you are told that paying taxes is voluntary, but that you can nevertheless get water, fire coverage, police, and education for free. I mean, I can't think of any place in the United States where that would be the case. But what the conservatives have done with right to work is make it appear that it's about freedom. It's not about freedom. Workers voted in a union. They voted. Right? They by majority, they asked for a union to come in. The union, by law, is obligated to represent all the workers in that bargaining unit, irrespective of membership, irrespective of religion and politics, etc. So I'll give you an example. This is a true story. A worker was in a particular industry where they did not have to join the union or pay any kind of representational fee. Their hours were shifted. And they went to their union. They were not a member. They went to the union and said, what was done to me was unfair. I need you to do something about it. The union filed a grievance, represented the worker, and won. They won his case.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, the worker said, thank you, but I'm still not joining. So basically, what right to work is the right to be greedy. And the aim of those who are pushing it is to weaken unions. That's what it is. It's basically saying that a union needs to spend all of its resources on workers, irrespective of whether they're union members, irrespective of whether they pay a fee. There's no other institution in the United States that is under that kind of obligation. So you have to ask, well, then why are unions? And it's because the people that are pushing right to work don't want unions to exist.
Now, what about also states that have at will employment? Like you were discussing earlier, say, oh, well, I don't need you today. You're gone. You didn't do anything. How does unions supposed to respond to that?
At will employment ends the moment you have a collective bargaining agreement. All right. So in other words, at will employment is the status of most workers who are not in unions. The only exception is if someone has a personalized contract. You've worked out not a personnel policy, but a personal contract with the employer that lays out the terms. But other than that, you're at will. And a lot of workers are under this misunderstanding that they think, for example, that let's say that there's a personnel policy, and the personnel policy says, before you will be terminated, there will be a hearing. What courts have demonstrated over and again is that even with a personnel policy, the company is not obligated to follow it. So you can have the nicest personnel policy in the world. If you don't have a union, they can come in and they can say to you, you know what? We don't like the way you look. We don't need you. You're out. And that's that. So every state in the United States permits at-will employment unless a worker is represented by a union or unless they have a personal contract. Now, for those of your listeners that say, well, I'm going to get a personal contract. Getting a personal contract is very, very difficult and is usually restricted to people almost in the stratosphere. People that are have a very, very unique skill, or where you're talking about huge sums of money. But for most regular people, if you went in and said to the employer, well, I want a personal contract, they would tell you where to go, how to get there, and at what rate of speed. But you're not going to get a personal contract.
Yeah, and also, with these companies that, let's say if you have a job and you're like, you know what, we want a union around here. We tired of at-will employment. And you notice because of at-will employment, the companies will retaliate on the person or persons that actually want to bring a union in. Now,
Right.
Is that legal to retaliate? And do you have a right to bring a union in if possible?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, it's a few questions. So first of all, workers in the private sector have a right to form a union as per the National Labor Relations Act passed in 1935. And you are supposed to be protected from retaliation on the part of the employer if you form or join a union. You're supposed to be. Now, I'll get back to that. In the public sector workers are covered by either state law or federal law. So for federal employees, they're covered by the Federal Labor Relations Act. In every state, there are state laws that indicate whether public workers, like state workers, county workers, municipal workers, have any right to organize. All right, so let's go just with the private sector. In the private sector, although you are supposed to have the right to organize, there are many employers that will fight you. And the problem is that the penalties for unlawful conduct by an employer are relatively weak. It's mainly restoring someone with full back pay and benefits, but you don't have extraordinary penalties meted out against an employer that would truly discourage an employer from carrying out retaliation. That's one of the reasons that the labor laws really need to change. But there's another part to this which not enough people really talk about. Why should an employer be involved at all in a worker's choice of representation. A union doesn't represent the employers, it represents the workers. So why should an employer have anything to say? Why should they be able to say anything about a choice of representation? So a company can choose its own lawyer, a law firm, to represent it. That's different from a union, but the analogy you'll understand. The workers are not consulted about the law firm. The workers cannot interfere with the employer picking a law firm. That's up to the employer. So why should employers have any involvement, be permitted any involvement in a worker's choice of representation? If the workers in a particular company do not want union representation, that is entirely their right. But if workers want union representation, why should they have to sit in meetings with employers, which often happens? They're called captive meetings, where a worker will sit in a meeting, maybe even by themselves with an employer, while the employer tells them all kinds of horror stories about why they shouldn't join a union.
Yeah.
Why should that be permitted?
It shouldn't be permitted. And usually, you say about the companies, well, I get why the companies don't really want a union, because let's say if you have one employer and this employer is paying below industry standard, the union comes in and say, well, you're not paying them, not even industry standard, so you got to up the pay. Well,
Right.
before the employer was getting away with that. Now they can't because of this union. Usually
Right.
those who fight against unions is the ones that don't want to pay anything.
Oh, no, you're absolutely right. But there's another part to it that's interesting. It's not just money, it's that most employers do not want to have any negotiation with their workers about anything. Employers generally like to be dictators. Now, they may be benevolent dictators, or they may be malevolent dictators, but they like to be dictators. They like to know, this is my company and this is the way it's going to run, despite the fact that they are not the ones producing anything. They happen to be running a company and getting the profits. But it's regular working people that are actually putting things together. And so many employers simply do not want to be in a situation where the workers say to them, well, we have problems with this, the way this is being done. They don't necessarily want the workers coming to them and saying, actually there may be a different way of doing this. One of the things that I've seen, I've worked in all kinds of places. When I got out of college, I went to work at a shipyard. And I'll tell you that shipyard workers could figure out any number of things in terms of a better way of building a ship than the management could. But the management never asked their opinion, never asked them, well, what are we doing wrong? Is there another way to do this? Is there a way we can do it faster? Is there a way that we can guard against certain kinds of problems? Management acted as if the workers were all stupid.
Yeah, and I've worked in a shipyard myself, long time ago. So I definitely, see the conditions and the hard work that goes into shipyards. Also, when I used to work on the water, about 2.5 years, I worked on the water, and we would go to the different shipyards as well. We had a messed up, maybe an engine, or one of the wheels was bent or something, and those guys working a lot of times hard conditions,
Yeah.
and without minimal breaks, and so yeah, it's just not good in the shipyard industry at all.
Right. No, in the 1970s. I don't know what it is today, but in the 1970s, shipbuilding was the second most dangerous industry in the country. The first was mining, and people were killed all the time. I had an industrial accident. I fell 20 feet. I survived. I was lucky. A week before me, someone had fallen 9 feet and died. I mean, it was very, very difficult. Fortunately, we had a union. And it wasn't the best union in the world, but it was a union. And there were certain rights that we had that were won that made a heck of a difference.
Yeah, and if you have a good union rep that's out there, at least definitely in the petrochemical industry, if the company trying to get you to do something safe, you can call a union rep and they say, hey, they want me to do this, and they're like, oh, no, 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 that's way too unsafe. Let me get the safety
That's right.
guy out here too, and let's discuss this before you do it.
That's
And,
right.
and I like to see that in a union, that you have a good union rep out there,
I agree. I
taking
agree.
care of you.
I mean, this goes full circle back to our initial discussion. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, this is why unions need to transform. This is the kind of fight that I and many other people have been engaged in to make them stronger and effective advocacy and representational institutions, because it really can be a life or death situation in the petrochemical industry, in shipyards, in any number of things. I look in baseball. You for years you had something that was called the reserve clause that basically made all players in effect indentured servants to the different teams. You would be brought in to a particular team, and you were in with that team until the owner decided to get rid of you. It was when you had the development of the Major League Baseball Players Association that started organizing, and the actions of St. Louis Cardinals player Curt Flood, who fought this, and eventually the union was able to win a collective bargaining agreement to bring in the reserve clause in for a landing, and to bring in and introduce free agency, that all of a sudden the conditions of baseball players changed dramatically. Increases in salaries, better conditions, etc. It was through organization. It made a tremendous difference.
Yeah, and you have a good union, like I said, and they take care of you. That's definitely a blessing. And if you have that opportunity to get involved with a union, and they're worth it, of course, because I know unions is good. Consider looking into getting involved with a union. But I want to switch gears here and ask you, since you grew up through the time of our brothers and sisters and the civil rights movement as well. I want to ask you about today and the racial climate of today, because for what I'm seeing today, what do you compare today to back in that time period?
We are we are witnessing a backlash that actually began in the late 1960s. But if you think about it like a wave approaching the shore, it's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. In this election, we witnessed the most racist, sexist, xenophobic candidacy that we have seen since George Wallace. And this candidacy and this presidency, it is an immense threat to democracy, and it's a threat to racial justice. If you think about the Trump speech to Congress on February 28th, he spent an inordinate amount of time attacking immigrants of color. Just notice what he said and what he did not say.
Mm-hmm.
When he was talking about immigrants, he wasn't talking about immigrants from Russia, wasn't talking about immigrants from Ireland. He was talking about immigrants from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia. So he racialized immigration. He basically suggested that immigrants from Latin America are the major sources of crime. Well, let me ask you this. What is the most feared criminal organization in the United States? It's the Russian mafia.
Mm-hmm.
The last time I checked, Russia was not south of the Rio Grande. And yet, not once in Trump's campaign nor in his speeches has he talked about the threat of the Russian mafia. If you're going to talk about crime being brought here by immigrants, then what about the Russians? What about the Poles? What about Irish? And so that's when you see the way that they're playing this racial game with us. And it was even more sophisticated in his speech to Congress, because he attempted to pit African Americans against immigrants of color. I mean, if you remember, and notice what he did when he was talking about victims of crimes from immigrants, he pointed to an African American who had been a victim. I mean, let's be real. The major sources of crime in this country and violence are not immigrants, neither documented nor undocumented. But here's another thing. You notice the way he talked about terrorism, and again suggested that the terrorism mainly comes from outside of the United States. Well, let's correct the record. And this is where this issue of race comes in again. Since September 11, 2001, the majority of terrorist attacks and incidents in this country have been committed by white supremacists, not by Muslim terrorists. And then you add on to that, the majority of the terrorist attacks that have been carried out by Muslims in this country have been carried out by people who were legally in this country, not by people who snuck in. So what you see is a president and a presidency that is manipulating the facts and manipulating us and touching various racial raw nerves. So when you ask, what does this compare to? It compares to the period right after the Reconstruction in the United States. That is, in the period after 1876, when there was a counterattack on all the victories that had been won since the Civil War. And you had a move towards segregation, what came to be known as Jim Crow segregation. You had the disenfranchisement of millions of African Americans and actually many poor whites. That's what this starts to feel like. Now, the good news is that people are fighting back. And I think that the women's marches, the day after the inauguration, I think that these people showing up at these town hall meetings, all of this is really marvelous. And it's exactly the need for resistance. But yes, it is very scary, and particularly when you have a presidency where this administration is playing a game with race. It knows what buttons to push in order to get white people to feel particularly insecure. And not just white people. There are some African Americans who have lost track of what's really going on, and they themselves fall into the trap of saying, well, it's immigrants are the problem. Last time I checked, I have not found one factory that's been closed down by immigrants, not one shipyard that's been closed by immigrants, not one city where immigrants cut off the money or influenced or stopped the banks from coming forward with money. I haven't found one. Those are the people that I'm looking for. Those are the people that we need to focus on.
Well, you said a lot of, I want to kind of touch on that. In America, white America, just in general, is never going to blame white America for its problems. Period. It's just not going to do it. They talk about these jobs being shipped overseas. It was white corporations that shipped your jobs off to China, to Vietnam, to Mexico, etc. You talk about illegal immigration. You want to build a wall and you want to say get the illegals out and have ICE agents rounding them up, which you could do that. But why won't you say, you know what? I'm gonna stop illegal immigration this way. I'm gonna start jailing these white-owned business owners for hiring them, which is against the law because they're criminals. Let's start hauling them off to jail too. And if they start hauling off these business owners to jail, then that'll stop that too. It's called supply and demand. If they can't get a job, then they'll probably stop coming, right? But they never mention about hauling off these business owners to jail for hiring illegal immigrants.
Right.
You see, it's stuff like that. And what you were saying earlier about the immigrants, common sense says that immigrants don't do all that stuff. We know that. But you now in relation to black people, yeah, some black people take the okie doke about some of that. But I'm gonna tell you what a lot of black people not saying a whole lot about the immigration thing is because a lot of black people are tired. They're tired because we've been fighting for everybody. Then when we get killed in the street, when we need the same people to help us, we don't see nobody around. You can go back even to the civil rights movement. You can look at, black people was reaching out to the Asian community to help them, the Jewish community, all these different groups who were discriminated against under the system of Jim Crow and all the other systems that they had back in that time period. Because remember, Italians and Irish, Jews, and all these other ones didn't have that white card. If it wasn't for the civil rights movement, now they got the white card. And when they got their white card after the civil rights movement, they were like, forget black people. They don't help. They never helped us. They turn their nose up at us. They look down on us. Why you guys don't do this for yourself and do that for yourself? Everybody turned their back on us. And black people got to a point and say, man, forget this. We're tired of fighting for everybody else. And then when we shot down the street, our Tamir Rice is shot down, or Walter Scott shot in the back, or all these other, people are constantly dying in our community, and we have no one to fight for us like we fought for them. So that's why I feel that we sitting down.
Not so fast. Not so fast. If you actually look at what's happened in the movement for Black Lives, and you can actually see this visually, the demonstrations that have emerged have actually been very mixed. I don't mean a mixed bag. I mean mixed racially. That you have actually touched a raw nerve, particularly among younger people, where you have large numbers of whites, Latinos, Asians that have come forward. I think that you're absolutely right that different groups do get played off against one another. That's absolutely the case. And we as a people have tended to be willing to be supportive, as we should, because the thing is that this is a battle for democracy. This really is. This is a battle when you're fighting against any injustice. You actually are fighting also to protect yourself. And so when we step forward, when immigrants are being attacked, it's not just fighting for them. It's fighting to make sure that what's being done against immigrants does not soon happen to us. Look at what happened with Muhammad Ali Jr. just the other day, right? He's coming into the country with his mother, and these ICE agents start interrogating him and hold him for 2 hours. So you're damn right, we need to be speaking up against this kind of xenophobic insanity. This is not just about protecting other people. This is about defending ourselves. I'll tell you, every time I come into the United States, when I've been overseas, I worry. Am I going to be stopped? Am I going to be locked up? Why? Because I am frequently identified as being something else. North African, Palestinian, Ethiopian, Eritrean, Cape Verdean, any number of things. And my Lord, if I'm wearing a kufi, oh boy, I know that that they have focus on me. I mean, this is why when we speak up, when we're talking about this xenophobia and this incredible fear of the other, this is about protecting ourselves too. This is not just about protecting someone else.
Well, you have to understand too by these people, and before I get into those people, we have been suffering at the hands of these white racialized terrorist devils for over 400 years. Okay,
Right.
Donald Trump doesn't really surprise me. He's like, oh my God, Donald Trump. No, because if you knew your history, Donald Trump is nothing to be shocked about. That's just kind of how I take Donald Trump. Okay, now the only thing I'm saying is that other groups now are starting to get what we have been getting.
That's right.
And now they're saying, hey, black person, let's join together. And a lot of black people now are saying, well, where were you the past 8 years when the race soldier police were just gunning us down? That's what you were saying about other people coming out in the Black Lives Matter protest. Yes, I've seen that. I've even filmed some of the protests. Okay, I know exactly what you're talking about. But we're not talking about those people. We're talking about that, the majority who say they're not racist. That group. All these people saying that they want to come together, and yet it's only a small amount when you be there to do that. Or you may have a white group who's doing something like White People for Black Lives. They're trying to fight, and we don't see more people joining them as they should. I mean, they look at them as outcasts. You still have that happen as well in the white community.
No, that's true, but I guess part of what I'm suggesting is that you got to be careful about the conclusions you draw on two levels. One is that in any movement, in terms of the people that turn out and are active, is always a minority. The American Revolution, for example, people have gone back and studied it, and they found that among the colonists, only a third of the colonists supported the revolution. Only a third. And that a third supported staying with Britain. And that the middle third was the critical element. It was their sympathy that eventually got won that made the difference. 1/3. See, the thing is, you and I and others grew up believing that the American Revolution was virtually everybody rose up and said, we got to have this revolution. We got to break with Britain. And it turned out that was a myth. If you look at the civil rights movement, there's many people that think that the March on Washington, that there were zillions of people there, that everybody over the age of 60 was involved, every black person over the age of 60 was involved in the civil rights movement, and that half of them were in the March on Washington. It was a myth. The question of who gets mobilized is always complicated, but it's always a minority. The question is whether the majority can be won to support those who are the most active. So that's one piece of what I think we have to look at. The other piece is that I understand exactly what you're saying, that people are, in fact, black folks are tired of us getting whacked by the cops, whacked by these white supremacists, feeling isolated. I get that. The problem is, in the United States, this is not South Africa. We are, 15% of the population?
Allegedly, which I don't believe, but right. Allegedly.
Right, but we're certainly not 50%. And so we need allies. Now, one of the things that you think about, if you're in a fight for your life, and you're outnumbered, and some people show up to fight alongside you, it's unlikely that you're going to stop and say, well, wait a minute now. Why are you just showing up now? Why didn't you come 30 minutes ago? When they show up, if they're willing to fight on your side, and I know, you're going to say, hey, welcome to the fight. And we have some accounts that we have to settle. There's no question about it. But we have to also recognize that we need allies in order to win. That doesn't mean we should get on our knees and beg for allies. But it means that when there are people that are willing to fight alongside us, we should embrace them, and we should also get them to understand us, so that what we don't have is that when things calm down, they take off. Because that's one of the big concerns that I know black folks have had for years. That when things calm down, when things get better in the economy, the white folks take off, right, and leave us hanging. And that means we need to shape these movements. It also goes back to what it's talking about in terms of what we need out of unions. It's why we need black leadership in unions.
Well, let me see if I can clarify some things that you were saying, and I'm putting my message out there. When you're saying about, well, if you're in a fight and other people show up and become your allies, you're not gonna question about where you was here sooner. No, if we saw that happening, then let's say, for instance, immigrants, right? If we saw a bunch of immigrants coming out constantly, speaking out, doing what they, and I'm not saying none of them have, so let me make sure I put that out there. I'm not saying none have. We just hypothetical. So you've seen a mass influx of that happening when all these, race soldiers were killing these black people. Then when they go through it, black people gonna say, wait a minute, they were here for us. So we got to go speak up for them now. It's like we can't be quiet or any other group. That's what I'm saying. You described the perfect situation. So what I'm saying is that black people have constantly, stepped out there for everybody else. And then when, like you say, when things calm down, then why can't we have this coalition? And then the other thing about us being the face of some sort of revolution for others, when we show up, now you ratchet it up with the race soldiers and this government who don't really like us either. And now they're bringing out the militarized police and all that equipment when black people show up. But when you had all them white folks up there in Berkeley tearing it up, they didn't bring out no military style equipment for them. All these issues that white people have been protesting and even doing some rioting, you never saw the MRAPs. You never saw them police coming out there looking like they out of Call of Duty or nothing. You didn't see none of that. But black folks go up there talking about, protesting and Black Lives Matter, whatever, and now look like an occupying force.
Yeah, again, we have to say yes and no. In 1934, there was a massive strike of textile workers around the country. And in several states, the state National Guard militias were called out, and they were, and entire families of strikers were locked up in detention camps. We have a very violent history in this country of employers calling out goons. The Ludlow massacre in Colorado in the early part of the 1900s of strikers, largely white strikers, but also others who were machine gunned by the company, at the orders of the company. So yes, when it comes to us, this is where I would say this is nuanced. When it comes to us, violence is used against us without a second thought. We are treated differently than other segments of the population. White America does not understand our relationship with law enforcement. They just simply don't. And there is a differential in treatment that exists. There's no question about that. I'm not doubting that at all. I'm not questioning that. But I am saying that this state that we exist in, this government, is very capable of meting out incredible violence against whites. And it has happened historically. But what they also attempt to do is, as a way of trying to split us, is to target the most vicious violence at us and to say to whites, if you don't want that to happen to you, back away. At the end of the Civil War, or not in the Civil War, at the end of Reconstruction, that's a lot of what was happening. That white allies of black folks were being lynched and threatened that they too would be wiped one side's country to the other if they didn't remain silent and allow black people to be disenfranchised. So the violence is very interesting, the way that it happens. But you're absolutely right that there is a differential in treatment that can't be argued in terms of what happens. Every black person, unless they're completely insane, knows that when you go out there, we have to be very careful in the way that we deal with law enforcement compared to the way that whites are. I'm not doubting that at all. There's no debate.
So your solution to all this stuff with Trump is you think that the black community, the immigrant, Arab, all these different groups should bond together as one group and fight against what's going on. Is that the solution you're proposing?
I think that that there is a majority that's developing in this country that is changing the demographics. That by the middle of the 21st century, this will no longer be a majority white country. And this is one of the things that scares the mess out of a lot of these right wingers. And I'm saying that the people that are being stepped on by the wealthy in this country have an interest in coming together and fighting back. And that one thing that we cannot allow is the Trump administration to play us like the strings on a violin. We cannot believe that by being silent, then we will be protected. Do you remember after 9/11, there were black folks that started to say things like, well, now we're not the main targets anymore, right? And they started to say that they started to go after Arabs themselves, black folks, as if they now all of a sudden became true Americans. Well, that didn't last very long, because the attack on Arabs, the attack on Muslims, did not stop these white supremacists from moving against us. So we have to be the ones that are always thinking about who are our potential allies out there, right? How do we flip the script on the other side? And one of the things that means is that this country has to learn the black experience. It has to understand what we've gone through and how unique what we've gone through has been.
But don't you think Donald Trump is starting to give those other groups the black experience just a little bit?
Yes, he's given them the treatment, but now they got to understand it. You got to put this together. This is one of the reasons I'm a historian, because I think it's really important for people to understand history. They got to understand how this stuff plays out, what's motivating it, why it's happening, and what we can do about it. So I'm very much into building alliances. I think we build alliances so that we have the numbers, not the other side. Because see, at the end of the day, I'm interested in winning. I'm not interested in complaining.
Well, like for me personally, I hear what you're saying, and a smart thing is to build certain alliances if these alliances will work. I'm just really skeptical about things, and I have to, I guess, thoroughly vet you to figure out what you're about. Because, like I said, we got people in our own community we can't even come together with. We divided on so many different things. I liken it to tribalism. That we are divided on. I'm gonna do a whole different series on that, because we are just too divided within ourselves. So the only time we come together, even as black people, that the race soldiers or whatever got to kill one of us, it has to be that extreme for us to say, you know what, I'm not gonna fight with you, I'm not gonna disagree with you. We put down our religion thing, that's differences, our whether you're pro-black or not, or whatever the case may be. We put all that down. Like, for instance, you have your Freddie Gray situations and Mike Brown and Trayvon Martin. Oh, we get unified so quick. We all brothers and sisters loving each other then, but it don't last long, and then we go right back to fighting again.
Right. The thing is that you never get involved in an alliance without vetting. But it's important. One of the things that we have to look at back on our own history, when we were captured in Africa and brought over here, when our ancestors were, many of us to this day just don't understand, how could black folks have allowed this to happen? How could they have sold, in some cases, their own people to the slave catchers? Mm-hmm. And the answer is they weren't. In their own minds, they weren't selling their own people. They were selling someone else. The fact that they happened to be black didn't mean anything more to them than the fact that French and Germans were white, and they nevertheless went through multiple wars. So what happened is that the slave catchers pitted kingdoms against kingdoms, empires against empires, because those different kingdoms did not recognize that they had a common interest against the slave catchers. And by the time they realized that they did, it was too late. That's the lesson we have to keep in mind. We've got to understand and always look, who do we share some common interests with, even if we don't necessarily like them, even if we don't necessarily trust them? Who do we share some interests with? And then we work carefully to build up the alliances we need so that we can win.
All right, Bill, well, I definitely thank you for joining us on the show today. How can people get in contact with you in case they want to continue the conversation?
Well, thank you. I have a website, which is billfletcherjr.com. I'm also on Twitter at Bill Fletcher Jr. and also on Facebook. So please, I encourage people to reach out to me.
All right. Well, you make sure everyone to reach out to Bill and to continue the conversation. And Bill, you have a great night.
You too. Take care.
All righty.